to have a connected view or grasp of things. How best to, and when you come, what Newman meant by the liberal arts, actually he had in mind the medieval liberal arts, which not at all what we would nowadays think of as the liberal arts, because the medieval liberal arts, which of course were basically essentially founded on the classics, the study of classical literature, languages, philosophy, but also included mathematics, also included music. So again, it's very misleading for people who have been misled by that, thinking that Newman thought that university everyone should study English literature or history or philosophy. That's not at all what he had in mind. He was actually very pragmatic. He said the best subjects, what we want at university is subjects that teach people to think. And you may have seen in the newspapers recently there's been these so-called, what they call soft subjects that some schools do, and of course then they can't get into the top universities because, you know, if you're doing hotel management, they won't look at you at Oxford. So somebody is immediately disadvantaged, but some of the schools apparently, I think they're called soft subject or something. So, in other words, subjects that I suppose the elite universities don't think actually train people's mind, don't teach them, you know, not mind forming. How best, Newman writes, to strengthen, refine, and enrich the intellectual powers. That's what he's concerned about. Whatever the subject of study, he says, it doesn't matter what the subject of study is, provided it provides the most robust and invigorating discipline for the unformed mind. And you see, people very often misunderstood what Newman was talking about. They think Newman was talking about culture in the sense in which Matthew Arnold talked about it in Culture and Anarchy, which is essentially the American Great Books program. Arnold defining it as to, what's he say, or to know all that is best that has been thought and said, or something like that. In other words, it's a cultural program that Matthew Arnold had in mind. That's not what Newman has in mind. What Newman has in mind is of course he thinks it's a good idea to be cultured, to read literature, to know about music, art, but that's not what the prime purpose of the university for him is. The prime purpose is to teach people, is to form people's minds. And he thought the same was true at the school level too, and I'll go on to that in just a moment. To produce people who can think. And let me just quote to you what he says in the discourses on this point. The real cultivation of mind, the force, the steadiness, the comprehensiveness, and the versatility of intellect, the command over our own powers, the distinctive just estimate of things as they pass before us. This is the aim of university. When the intellect has once been properly trained and formed to have a connected view or grasp of things, it will display its powers with more or less effect according to its particular quality and capacity in the individual. In the case of most men, it makes itself felt in the good sense, sobriety of thought, reasonables, and so on. You know, I remember a colleague of mine some years ago saying to me at university, saying, you can tell, you know, when you examine at the end of the degree, you can tell what class the student's going to get by reading the first few sentences. And there's a lot in the truth in that, you know. Because if the first sentence makes sense, well, that's, and looks as if it's addressing the subject, that's pretty good, you know, you're onto a winner then. And then if the second sentence follows from the first, then you know this is pretty, you know, now this person is certainly heading for a 2-1. But that's the reality. But if the first sentence doesn't really make it, it has nothing to do with the subject they're being asked to answer, the question they've been asked. And then the second sentence doesn't follow something about something different. And then you know this is, you know, you're into 2-2 class 3 territory, you see. So it's actually, there's some truth, I think, in that, sadly. You can soon tell whether somebody has had, you know, can think straight, can think properly and consecutively, and can think to the point, you know, as opposed to, and I always say this to students every year, it doesn't have much effect really. Answer the question. I'm sure you've said that too. Answer the question. You know, because they get nervous, and so they unload on paper everything they know about, you know, they see the question, they, oh, well, now what do I know about that subject? And so they unload it all on the paper, and they're not answering the questions, they're wasting time. You know, so the first couple of pages, they're not scoring any marks. You know. But you say this, I say this year after year, I'm sure you do too, it doesn't have any effect. I shouldn't seem to have any effect. Now, this is what he says. He doesn't, in the discourses, the discourses were very abstract. Very unlike Newman, of course, very abstract statement of what his position about education is. But there is one passage I wanted to quote to you, because this actually does refer to schools as well, and which he elaborates in the second half of the university in his essay, Elementary Studies. Suffice it then to say here that I hold very strongly that the first step in intellectual training is to impress upon a boy's mind the idea of, excuse me, I forgive the sex, the gender business, the idea of science, method, order, principle and system, of rule and exception, of richness and harmony. This is commonly done, excellently done, by making him begin with grammar and so on. And then he goes through various subjects, he says, which are very important for training the mind. Now, Newman is very emphatic in the idea of university, and that knowledge is not the same as education, because, of course, the problem had already arisen in his own day with the rise of the printing press. Well, the printing press has been around for a long time, but the extension of popular education, beginnings of the rise of the newspapers, periodical literature. But, of course, in our day, it's made even more serious by the internet. Now, I don't know about schools, but universities have all these filter systems where they filter to see if they put the thing, I don't know how they do it, through a test to see if the thing is being plagiarized. And of course, people today are exposed to this huge amount of information, because on the computer there is a library of everything, the whole world. And so it's a great danger to think that being exposed to a whole lot of Newman thought, and I'm sure that's absolutely right, that a whole lot of knowledge, being exposed to a great deal of information, is not the same as being educated. It can be the opposite. It can actually lead someone to become hopelessly disorganized in their thoughts and to have no real sense of things. And this certainly happens with students at universities, is they download things from the internet and just sort of string them together, you see. There's no sort of connection between them. And of course, when it comes to the exams, then of course they will have they're liable to have their stuff filtered, and then of course they can be caught doing this. But that's a very important point that Newman makes, I think, that it's not the same as knowledge. But of course he sees that knowledge is important, that you've got to know things. And there's I hope I won't be torn to pieces by any religion teachers here this evening, but there is a remarkable passage in that essay article of his Elementary Studies in the second half of university, where he tells the story of 3 Anglican clergymen on holiday in Ireland. And they come across a 13-year-old boy, a peasant boy, 13-year-old boy, and they sort of think, wouldn't it be fun to know, about Roman Catholicism? Remember, there are very few. And he was talking now about, before 1845, he's talking, these probably colleagues of his at Oriel, I dare say. And he would have heard this story when he was an Anglican. So he asked this boy, an educated boy, well, what do you believe? And the boy puts them all to silence. And these are the dreaded words, merely by knowing and understanding the answers in his catechism. That's a very important point Newman's making there. The boy knows something and has some sense of what it means, so he can answer the question. And it puts these clergymen, they're absolutely floored by this, that they get an exact answer. That same Elementary Studies is interesting there, because Newman actually applies his idea of liberal education to a school, and he has an imaginary examination where somebody's being examined, and it's extraordinary. This great classic work is very, a lot of people, of course, don't read the second half of the idea of university, which is why you regularly have it said that Newman didn't believe in research, which is actually not true. He said what an empire is in the political sphere, a university is in the sphere of research. That's constantly being said. I've done my best to rebut it, but it goes on being said, of course. But in this elementary, in this article, Elementary Studies, he actually goes through the kind of, the nitty-gritty of what he sees the successful school teaching is trying to achieve, and he goes through it in a very minute way. The training of the pupil's mind, get the pupil to understand things and to answer properly, to answer to the point. So I hope, because I think it's practically pretty well 1:30 now, and I was told to stop at 1:30. But I hope you've realize that one thing, in case I'm sure you all have heard of Newman's idea of university, but I dare say many of you didn't know just how interested he was in school teaching. And not only in the oratory school, not only with children well educated coming from the middle classes, but actually interested that he took those pains at that time of great crisis in his life, when he was a very, very famous man. He was fascinated, he was delighted to be out there in Littlemore and to be with these little village children, poor children, nothing, and actually teaching them the catechism, teaching them to sing, and and even deciding the girls should have white pinafores. I mean, it's extraordinary. You can't imagine. Well, I can't imagine the Holy Father doing that sort of election. You can imagine Hans Urs von Balthasar doing anything like that. So it is a remarkable fact, I think, that, and I hope that for you, as like many of you teachers here tonight, to be able to reflect on that Blessed John Henry Newman was an educationist and wrote the classic work on universities, but nevertheless, his heart was, we can see at certain points in his life, his heart was very much wrapped up, not in university, but actually in an elementary, it wasn't even primary school, it had been a sort of village school. I don't know what, they had probably left at the age of about 11, I suppose, in those days. And that he was actually, that absorbed his energies during that Lent of 1840, when he was already beginning his Anglican crisis. Thank you.